Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here with you this morning. I'm part of a much larger organisation, of course, Rabobank, which is one of the largest lenders to farmers and food companies around the world. And we consider ourselves different in at least three regards. One, we specialise in food and agriculture all around the world. Two, still a cooperative here today. And third, we are a global business, not just a large lender in, say, the US or Europe. We do lend money in almost every region of the world where we produce major amounts of food or indeed consume it. As part of that global business, Rabobank has long thought that we do a better job of being a business partner to our clients rather than just a lender of money if we actually understood the businesses you're involved in and the market in which you operate. So we have invested over the years in a very large team of research analysts, the Food and Agribusiness Research and Advisory team of which I'm a part. We have almost 90 analysts today located in all the regions. You see flags denoted there, and tend to specialise in addition to our regions along commodity lines. We do this because we think we can learn enormous amounts from what is going on in different parts of the world, both in terms of being able to bring together a coherent global view of markets, but also taking best practice and bringing it to other regions. Might sound a little bit familiar to you as part of the Nuffield Program, which really links me to this gentleman here. I won't call for the answer, but how many of you know who this is? No? No, not a one. Okay, this is William Morris, Lord Nuffield, the patron of your organisation. And I put him up not to embarrass you, but to make some comments about really this program and why it was founded and what was happening at the time, because I think there are some really pertinent observations around that. Lord Nuffield sent forth the first scholars, agricultural scholars, in 1947 to head out around the world and look at what was happening and bring that back to the United Kingdom. But this was post-war Europe in which this idea was really brought to fruition. And a number of things were going on in that environment. One, the world was short of food. The stresses of 6 years of international warfare had left the world's food supply chains distorted, closed down, and production severely compromised. So we were short of food. Secondarily, we had major health issues around food at the time. Much of the world was malnourished as a result of warfare also. Thirdly, and partly off the back of that, we saw a wave of health policy launched and food policy. Governments were somewhat reluctantly drawn in to the food industry by warfare, not necessarily by welfare concerns, but to try and make sure that they had people strong enough to actually fight in wars. We saw governments drawn into the policy environment and a lot of shifts in regulation. And finally, World War II had really necessitated or catalysed an acceleration of scientific research and development. And we'd seen a wave of technology start to hit the market, whether that was rapid development of sonar, radar, penicillin hit the market, synthetic rubber. We saw rapid acceleration of computer technology. So in this environment of food shortages, health concerns, shifting regulatory landscape around food, an environment of innovation and availability of new technologies, Lord Nuffield saw that this was a time to really look to tap into what was around, because this is going to be a period of innovation and substantial change. And it was in the food industry as well. At one end of the supply chain, coming out of World War II, we saw the rapid commercialisation of synthetic fertilisers on farm. Down the other end of the chain, we saw novel developments such as M&Ms. M&Ms melts in your mouth, not in your hand. It was not so that kids could take that to school and experience that benefit. It was so US Marines and soldiers in the Pacific could carry chocolate without it melting by being wrapped in candy. So I think this is pertinent because we see generally in the world, and certainly in food, great advances are made in our industry at times of great need, particularly in an era of rapid general technological innovation. And that was what was happening when Lord Nuffield set up this foundation and the scholarships that are still going today. Now, we hear the term history repeats, or if people try to be clever, maybe it doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. But I think that it's very interesting to reflect back on that and where we find ourselves today. Let's consider a few things. Stretched food markets. Well, that's starting to happen again today. We have, at the moment, at least a temporary reprieve from that in the grains complex, certainly. But generally, in the last 8 years or so, we found food markets increasingly tight, and most of us think we face a challenge going forward to produce enough food and get it to market in the next 10 to 15 years. Health issues around food, well, they're arising again. This time, less so malnourishment, though still exists in the emerging market. This time, obesity. This is a huge issue for the global food industry. Rapid rise in technological innovation, well, that's happening again and has been happening for some time. We've talked in recent decades about Moore's Law, which essentially says that computing power doubles every 18 months to 2 years, creating exponential growth in our ability to compute things. And we carry that technology, of course, these days in our pockets. Changing regulation around food and ag, well, I think that's starting to rear its head again, and we're going to return in a second to that issue. But this time round, we have an additional challenge that didn't exist in post-World War II Europe, and that is that we're increasingly concerned about the environment, climate change, and our role in that. So I think that today the conditions for innovation are in place again, and the need for it is once more in our industry extremely significant, and that makes this a very challenging era to be in food and agriculture, but a very exciting era too, and one I think that Lord Nuffield would in many ways recognise. So today I wanted to step through a presentation in a couple parts. Firstly, talk about, can we tell the future? Because we're going to talk about what we think's coming. It might be reasonable to discuss how accurate can we reasonably expect to be on that. Secondarily, our view on some of the emerging trends that we expect to shape agriculture in coming years. Not all of them, not the most obvious ones, but we've picked out 6 that we think are worth thinking about, and also to stimulate the process of thinking of how the future impacts us. And then some comments on sensible planning for uncertain times. If this happens, what might be the impact on us? And then what can we actually do about that? But firstly, perhaps hands up again. Who thinks we can tell the future? No. So, yes, 1. Fantastic. 1 hand out of 2 questions. Extremely challenging, of course, and that makes my presentation hard because I've been asked to talk about the future of ag and none of you believe I can do it. But I wanted to add a little bit of nuance here into the discussion because I think it's important. Sometimes it appears we can tell the future. Anyone know who that is? Yep? Marty McFly. Thank you, Lockie. Back to the Future, the movie in 1985 that envisaged travel to the far-flung era of 2015. And they envisaged as filmmakers that there might be a hoverboard by that time. And lo and behold, in 2014, 1 year ahead of planning, Hendo released the first hoverboard. This one is even more pertinent. Anyone recognise that? No? Fair. I'll ask you a question you can answer at some point, probably. But this is a screen grab from a film called 2001: A Space Oddity, released in 1968. And it showed, as part of the technological environment, that we might have something that looked a bit like a book, but had a big screen on it, and we could read data off it and interact with other people whose faces would actually appear on the screen. Now, that doesn't sound sound too far-fetched for us anymore. And this was fascinating because actually a few years ago, when Apple sued Samsung for copying the iPad, Samsung said that the likeness between Stanley Kubrick's technology in that movie and the iPad was so similar that it made Apple's patents void. So sometimes it does appear we can tell the future. Other times, the Jetsons, they thought we'd be flying around in spaceships, living on houses pinned up in the cloud. So we get it a bit wrong. But in all seriousness, I believe that we can tell the future. It's the degrees of certainty around that. So if I tell you next Friday the sun will rise, I'm pretty sure you're going to be with me on that. There's a reasonable degree of certainty on that. If I can tell you that it's probably going to be a cold day because it's winter, the degree of certainty goes down, but it's fairly high. If I'm going to tell you it rains at 11 o'clock, we might forecast that, but our certainty around that diminishes. So it's important when you consider what might happen in the future, how certain am I around that? Because that should impact how you respond to it. Secondarily, the timing of the event can be just as important. Now, we just said the sun will probably rise on Friday, probably rise the year after, 10 years after that. But actually, there's a lot of scientific evidence that one day the sun will not rise again. Suns actually have a finite lifetime. But that's probably 6 billion years away. So we don't need to worry about that or factor it into our planning. So second consideration, what do we think is going to happen? But when's that going to happen? Because that matters to me as a planner. And thirdly, and I think often overlooked, is the rate of its development. And that can be very important too. So most of us these days believe that the climate is changing. But how quickly is it changing? That's really important to how we respond to it. So we feel at Rabobank, and me personally, it's worth considering the future. Any plan we make factors in some assumption of the future. We may as well have a go at looking at what might be coming and plan accordingly. But when we do that, we need to factor in not just the event, but when it might happen and how quickly before we commit to action. So let's jump into some emerging trends that we think will shape ag. And we've chosen 6 here. The first one is, at the moment, we're concerned with what is going on economically and politically globally, that we may see a flight to protectionism in world markets. And the story goes pretty much like this. World economic growth has been much slower in the last 5 years than it had in the preceding 5 years. We've struggled to get even to average economic growth. The second problem is any economic recovery or the benefits from that since the financial crisis have largely accrued to wealthy people, or the top 1%, leading to really popular dissatisfaction with the way that economies are running and the way the benefits from things like globalisation have been distributed. That has led to fairly major decision-making, such as Britain just recently voting to leave the European Union, which is essentially a move away from liberal trading regime to something that will be less so. We also see things like the rise of Donald Trump, whose prospects of becoming president are fading, but he has shifted the debate in the United States around free trade and really had pulled someone like Hillary Clinton, who was in favour of the TPP, into saying, oh, actually, I don't agree with it either. And it's not only the US that's doing this. Actually, a group called Global Trade Alert monitor the number of discriminatory trade measures implemented by countries around the world. 4 or 5 years ago, that used to be 200, 250 each year. 750 last year. So this is a definite trend, and it's a concerning trend. What might be the impacts on us? Well, it will probably, if this continues, result in further slowdown in global economic growth. It will increase risks of reduced market access for our products. We need to export a lot of our food and fibres, and a lot of the growth will come from that. We have enormous interests in maintaining market access. And even if we can maintain general market access, there will be probably more sporadic disruption to that, which makes it extremely difficult to plan businesses. If one day you can export live product to Indonesia, the next moment that is cut off from you. So what can we actually do about this? Because this is a fairly big picture, I appreciate that. One, it's still important for us as an industry to advocate and lobby for open trade, transparent trade rules and consistency of their application. Secondarily, it's important for us to have enhanced supply chain security. So that means when we see growth in a market, we have to consider not just the opportunity of that, but how can we set up a supply chain that's secure into that market? I think we've seen alarm bells around this space in the rise of accumulation of food products in Australia and parcelling that up and sending it up by post to China, which has seen great growth in some products in our marketplace. But then the Chinese get uncomfortable with it, they change the taxation regime, and there's disruption to that. As we look at growth markets like China, we have to think not just how can we produce the stuff to get it in there, but how can we set up a more secure, stable supply chain that's not going to see so much disruption. But also we think that industry has to factor in to its risk management decisions. The protectionism, sporadic or ongoing, is going to be a risk for us going forward that will contribute to things like market volatility, and we need to be conscious of that. Factor number two, I think something that goes under the radar a little bit, is that we're entering an era already in which we're seeing the rise of small brands. And we all tend to think, well, many of us tend to think, industry dominated by food companies, big food companies, they make all the running. It's been true for a lot of our lifetimes, but we're really seeing some swings here. And for a number of reasons. Firstly, we're starting to see the millennial generation, think 18 to 34-year-olds, entering an era where they have more spending power in most Western markets than the baby boomers, whose spending is starting to decline. And in general terms, we think about these people as more willing to experience, more willing to spend money on food, and more concerned about the environment and animal welfare. Secondarily, we see the rise of alternative channels to the consumer. That's mean that smaller companies have some chance of actually accessing people who might like their product. And if consumers do like their products these days, social media means they can tell people very quickly, found this product, really like it, and awareness of that and sales can go up quickly. So as a result of this, smaller food companies have been better at tapping into this stuff than bigger food companies. And for want of a more technical term, the big food companies have been smashed in their major markets in the last 5 years or so. In the US market, they've lost 3 percentage points of the marketplace. And in a market that's not growing that quickly, that's a major problem for them. What's it mean for us, largely as producers? Well, if we're dealing with larger companies, we should be aware that they've been forced to slash costs or try and merge to try and find a way of remaining profitable in this kind of environment. They're also trying to buy up small brands where the growth is, or invent small brands that appear to be small companies, even if they're backed by larger companies, to tap into these trends. Smaller players have an opportunity to tap into these consumer desires, so it's a real boon for small food companies, and they have the attractive option to develop a business and sell it to larger ones down the track. As producers, there's an opportunity here because a lot of these niche brands aren't just marketing spins. They want products that are more differentiated, may have a higher quality or different ingredients. So the brewing industry may want a different quality or type or origin of malting barley or hops than the traditional brewers. We see opportunities for downstream integration as greater than ever as consumers look for something with more provenance and differentiated from the traditional large food companies. Another thing that we think is coming that has pros and cons for us is the rise of substitutes. This isn't really new, and again, to draw the parallels with time of stress, really the quintessential food substitute product is margarine, that was invented at the sponsorship of Napoleon, whose armies were so great he was having trouble feeding them with the butterfat they needed, so sponsored a competition to come up with a substitute, which is somewhat ironic given how much the French now complain when the market's awash with butterfat. But we see this as a growing trend, and I think we're going to see a lot more of it. At one of the end of the spectrum, it's about affordability. So if you go into markets like Southeast Asia, Africa, parts of Latin America, we'll see a lot of cheap substitute products or using cheap substitute ingredients. This product, somewhat confusingly given it's called Alaska milk, is a Filipino milk product. And they have a range of dairy products that contain not dairy fat, but local cheaper vegetable fats like coconut oil or palm oil. So they've recognised there's a market for this product. People want dairy and the health attributes of that. But they can't necessarily afford it. So if we can't produce enough food at the right price points, substitutes are going to come in. To one extent, that's good. They help grow the category and they may trade up later. To some extent, it's a threat to us. Moving forward, I expect we'll see a lot more of that, and moving into areas such as the bug protein that we hear about now. And many of us may squeam about that, but there are already perfectly palatable bug flour biscuits on the marketplace. Now they're expensive because it's pitched at a wealthy consumer who wants to try something different. But in time, we will have availability of cheaper protein coming out of these sources. But it's not just about the price. We also see health concerns or ethical concerns leading to consumers looking for products like vegan foods. And I think that this is a space where we shouldn't underestimate how well people can mimic our products. And there was a great case actually in Whole Foods in the US a few years ago. They mixed up the labels on the chicken salad with the vegan chicken salad, where the chicken was made out of soy. Now, it took them about a week till they figured this out. And the reason is that no one realised that the switch had occurred. So the vegans are sitting there eating the vegan substitute salad thinking, this is an amazing product, it tastes like chicken. Now they'll go to hell now, so there's a downside. But they didn't realise. But more to the point, the people who thought they bought the chicken salad went home and consumed that, and no one complained. They thought that was chicken. Because it looks like chicken and it tastes pretty much like chicken. So we shouldn't underestimate what can be done here. Going forward, we've seen the first hamburger grown in a laboratory. Now that was an extremely expensive hamburger, but the technology is starting to be explored there. We're also seeing food substitutes come in, not because it's cheap or on ethical grounds, but for functionality. So this is a natural one. Stevia has gained a lot of running in recent years. It's a natural sweetener, but it has lower calorie count. So functionality can also bring substitutes in. And finally, convenience. We're seeing experimentation with 3D printing of food. Now, what is going to be the impact on us? Well, to some extent, this is competition for us, as I already mentioned. What can we actually do about it? Well, I think to some extent, we need to emphasise or address the concerns that consumers have that are leading to some of them to switch away. To the extent we can help control price volatility as an industry, that will benefit our competition with substitutes. If we can produce additional product at affordable prices, that will help maintain our market share. And to the extent that we can address their concerns, misplaced or otherwise, about what our environmental footprint is, how we treat people and animals in our supply chains, we stand a better chance of defending against this. Another change that I see is the rise of internet shopping. Slow in coming, but we can see from offshore there's a lot more headroom in this to come. I think I know the reasons I believe it will be more prominent is the inherent advantages of this in the choice, convenience and price, the amount of internet shopping we're starting to do in general that will make us more comfortable with buying food over the internet, the increased density of our cities going forward that will make it less convenient to duck out by car and buy food, and also the evolution of the models in this space. We've seen in Australia traditional retailers really struggle to get a good internet shopping model. I think that's going to start to change as new competitors come into the market, like Alibaba sending products to China via internet, or Amazon Fresh coming in to markets. Players that don't have investment in bricks and mortar that are going to approach this problem of how we set up food and internet shopping from a new angle and probably crack it a lot better than the existing retailers. So if this is up and running, what are the potential impacts? Well, the supply chain is going to change. The traditional sending food to the distribution centre, then out to retail outlets, is going to change considerably. There's opportunity for us to change our marketing strategies. If we're selling things over the internet, how we label them and what we emphasise in attributes will change. It's an opportunity to circumvent retailers. I don't think many of you will think that Australian retailers help you get a good margin in your businesses. This is an opportunity to circumvent. And it's an opportunity to segment the customers as a food industry we get in contact with and provide different messages to them that will help us tap into different things consumers are looking for. The rise of alternative funding models. Yes, I know we're a bank, so there's an irony here. But I think that along with the rise of the internet, we're seeing interest in different ways of bringing equity in particular into this marketplace. In 2006, 2007, we saw peer-to-peer lending platforms such as Lending Club set up. A few years later, crowdfunding options like Kickfunder started. Somewhat more recently, equity crowdfunding such as ag funding, bringing larger pockets of equity into agriculture. These are already starting to impact agriculture at different levels. The Lending Club, just picking a few examples off the internet, Michael Sulberg Wines in the US lent just $50,000 for 24 months. Some bridging finance he got from peers that he was struggling to get from banks. Kickstarter, this is Dough Donuts, vegan donuts in Portland, Oregon. They were looking for $5,000. Kickstarter is essentially giving money without getting too much back. It's more you believe in the concept. Agfunder, this is California Safe Soil, who just secured almost $6 million to recycle fresh food waste from grocery stores into high-value fertiliser. So we're starting to see the evolution of the internet and the interest in equity coming into agriculture and the desire to find ways to tap into that to grow food in different ways, seeing a lot more options of how we can get equity going forward, which is a clear opportunity for us as an industry. We are not involved in any of those groups, but we have got some ideas around this too. We've launched a couple of years ago in the US a concept called Food Bites, where we connect food industry leaders and investors with startup companies who are innovating and disrupting food and agriculture, and look to bring together those ideas and competency of the startup with the funds from the industry or investors. And we're trialling our first Food Bites in Sydney in early November. And we've got some exciting applications, but if you have concepts you're aware of, please become involved. The rise of digital agriculture is perhaps the most obvious and is at every conference that we see at the moment, but something we expect to change the face of ag going forward. Whether that's drones helping to manage livestock, virtual fencing, mapping of paddocks and precision agriculture, or technology that enables us to scan our crops with our phone and seek information on disease and treatment online. The reason we see this rising very quickly is that comes back to what was going on when Lord Nuffield started this program. There is such a rapid evolution of technology around us that we have enormous advantages to tap into that and bring it to ag. Ag hasn't been the first place that the tech people have looked to put their innovations, but it's seen as a blue sky space by them. We have an office in California, in San Francisco, and our food bankers are now surprised that if they're out socially, and there are a lot of tech people in San Francisco, people are now fascinated that they're in the food industry, and the tech guys are trying to tap into them to look for ways to bring what they know and their startups into the agricultural space. And one thing I think that's fairly obvious but perhaps overlooked is a reason why we're going to see a lot of this is because it's a technological innovation that our consumers and communities are not going to have big problems with. Through the history of ag in the last 50 or so years, synthetic fertilisers came on board, achieved enormous yield gains. There was no rejection at the time from community or society around that. We've seen enormous deployment of irrigation, which largely has been accepted as a technological deployment. Genetic modification, that I know Cecilia's about to discuss, actually has been one where we face some barriers of deploying that scientific knowledge into our space. This is one where I don't think we'll face those barriers, and hence the opportunity to deploy it is quite considerable. The impacts on this, I feel, is likely to strengthen the advantage of large farms to the extent that some of this technology there'll be economies of scale, and it enables us to monitor and manage vast tracts of land better. I think we're going to enter a space where farmers may need to be or employ knowledge workers going forward and look at how to harness and manage these things. I think that developed countries like ours will probably face an advantage in this over emerging countries as we get going. But we have to make sure that Australia is somewhere at the forefront of it, because there are barriers we face. There are larger farms in the US and Brazil. The size of the prize in developing technology and deploying it is larger in those markets. They may have better broadband than us. And service industries will need to evolve in how they interact with this also. So what should we do? Well, I think key is awareness of what is coming and what is likely to be relevant for your business. Secondarily, I think we need to be thinking about setting up businesses that can adapt to this technology, whether in the people we're employing or the way we run our operations. And thirdly, consider inter-system operability. If we're going to have drones in the paddock and virtual fencing and soil mapping, ideally all these systems are interacting in the way they do now with Apple products, for example, for consumers. The final point I'd like to make is really comes back to the title of my presentation, Future Shock. Again, this is harking back to the past, but we can learn a lot from what people said in the past. This was a book by a guy called Alan Toffler that came out the year I was born, 1970. And I think a lot of these points are becoming even more relevant. Because we mentioned before, the pace of change is going to be important for us and how we think of the future. His point was that technology and knowledge accumulation were accelerating, and people in the tech space talk about really exponential growth in technology as new technologies enable us to unplug new technologies, working together to create progress. Secondarily, the lag between the ideas and application was becoming shorter. So we came up with something, we could test it and commercialise it much quicker than we could in the past. And his concept was this was create a future where the future is arriving so fast it's disorienting. And I think if you speak to anyone over the age of 45, which I am now, that will resonate. Things have changed so quickly in our lifetime, it's a little bit disorienting. And some will thrive on this era of rapid change. Others will find it a real struggle. But I think you have to consider, is this something that you recognise, and how do you cope with this going forward? So finally, as I'm a little bit over time, how do we actually plan for this? I hope you've noticed that I've discussed not just the event, but how it might impact and what we might do. But more generally, we feel the future will bring a range of shifts, including the ones that we have mentioned. Some will benefit small producers, such as the rise of smaller brands. Some large producers. There's different things in here for different people. I think the same might be said of Australia and New Zealand's agricultural industry. Protectionism is a problem for us. Alternative funding is a real opportunity. The pace of change, I think, may just be as defining as the change that comes itself and is worth bearing in mind. How do we position for all this? Very important to keep an open mind and see that we recognise change early. Secondarily, usually success at individual and corporate level is about being an early responder when change arrives, but you don't have to be the first responder. Google wasn't the first internet platform. Facebook wasn't the first social internet platform either. We need some flexibility in our business to respond to this, whether it's financial flexibility, the people we have, or the way we operate. And it's just as important for you to be able to make an informed view of, is this change that Tim or others talking to me about really going to happen, or is it a false change that I don't respond to? We all need to come up with our views on that. And finally, as with anything that is changing, which can entail some risk, the capital we invest in these things should reflect the risk. This is something new, we can't be completely certain this is the way we're going, or maybe we're going this way, but there'll be different technology that unlocks it. Lord Nuffield was familiar with these issues, and he started the ball rolling in this foundation around responding to change at a time of great need and great opportunity. We ourselves as a bank believe in this quest and do a lot to try and tap into what's happening around the world, learn from it, and adopt a best practice. But going forward, it's really over to you as the people who implement this knowledge and these decisions to go out there, see what's happening, share with the knowledge that you have with your colleagues, and let's implement what we can and make the best fist of what Lord Nuffield had in mind for us of solving the world's food and ag problems and tapping into the opportunities going forward. Thank you very much for your time.